Thank you so much, Zia. I really appreciate the introduction and, of course, the invitation to talk to you guys about something that means a lot to me, I'm very passionate about, and I'm happy to share with you what I've learned. Assuming that most of you are new to manufacturing, I was there myself at one point, so I can appreciate the intimidation and how overwhelming it can be on learning how to get started. So, we talk prototype to scale. So I'm going to talk about the process of beginning the engagement with contract manufacturing and what's involved and what you need to be doing to get ready. So Zia already went through my credentials, so I can skip over this. But as she said, I've been doing this for quite a while, working in various different industries, drones, wearables, IoT, telecom equipment, you name it, I've probably been involved in manufacturing it. So I want to start with a definition. So what is mass production? So how do you know your product is in mass production? And the way I see it, it has to meet 4 specific criteria. So first off, you have to be able to sell it for money at full market price to any customer with full warranty. And if all 4 of these criteria aren't met, it's not a mass production product, it's a prototype. Okay? And that's one of the things I want to stress is there's a big difference between a prototype product and a mass production product. And there's a big gap to get from one to the next. Often undervalued and underestimated the amount of effort that it can take to go from prototype to production. Many people don't realize that the parts and the processes used to manufacture a mass production product, in fact, could be quite different from the same parts and processes used to do prototyping. All right, so one of the key elements of mass production is it's a much more rigid and controlled process. Your main objective is to remove the variance from these processes. You're also often using third-party suppliers to do all of the steps involved. You might be completely hands-off. You might be completely out of control of managing the nuances of your product, and something you have to accept. And you're also looking to repeat the process over and over and over and over, right? That is mass production. You're trying to optimize the process, improve the efficiency, improve the costs, and improve your yield. So how do you get there? So you have to pick someone, presumably a contract manufacturer, to handle the production. And that, as I said, can be very intimidating, or just people don't even know where to begin. So it's very easy to pick up some parts from the hardware store, or order some parts from DigiKey, or put together some fabrics and put together a prototype to get your initial idea together and show it to people, show it to potential customers, show it to potential investors. But it's not so easy all the time to find a contract manufacturer to actually produce it to the quality and the volume that you're expecting. And so that's what I'm going to get into. So this was actually where I was going to ask the same question from the audience about the, what percentage is working on electronics, in fabrics, apparel, textile, food. So while I admit there's lots of nuances to each industry, the way I like to see it is anything you're manufacturing has the same 7 key elements. Okay? You always start with some raw material or goods that you're purchasing from some independent supplier. You may or may not be transforming those raw materials into some other form before you assemble it. So in mechanical components, you could take plastics or metal, and you might mill them or injection mold them. For textiles, you might dye it. Food, you might season it, you might cure it, what have you, but you're transforming it, getting ready for assembly. Right before I do assembly, you want to inspect the goods. You want to make sure that all the materials you procured are actually the right parts, the right materials, the right ingredients. It's certainly possible someone made a mistake, and you don't want to start assembling something with the wrong components. You want to make sure they have the quality and the performance that you're expecting, and then you can begin the assembly process. Post-assembly, you often do another inspection to make sure it was assembled properly, it's working properly, it tastes right, it looks right, whatever it is. And then you do the final packaging. So how is it actually presented to the end customer? Is it in a box? Is it on a shelf? What have you? And then the final component, the logistics. How do you get your product from the manufacturer to your customer? Does it have to be inventoried? Does it get shipped? Is it hand delivered? Does Amazon use drones to deliver it? What have you? You need to figure out those logistics, okay? And that applies to any industry that's manufacturing a product. So what is contract manufacturing? So contract manufacturer is a third party that you've hired to procure the parts, to assemble the parts, and do the final testing. And a key component of a contract manufacturer is you're not their only customer. They will very likely have several customers in the shop at the same time, building very similar products to yours at similar volumes. And that's a good thing, and it can also be a bad thing. But you have to recognize that. And so this is commonly referred to as outsourcing. Why do we use contract manufacturer? Why not just manufacture the product yourself? Obviously, you know your product the best. You have all the intimate components of it. You're going to be able to recognize what's working, what's not working the quickest. So why trust someone else with it? Well, there's a lot of advantages that a contract manufacturer can bring. So first off is their experiences and resources. I guarantee you they've built similar products to yours many times over more than you have. They're going to be much better at it, much more efficient at it. They're going to be able to bring guidance and suggestions on how to improve your products. They're going to be able to better detect issues if they come up during the production process. And you want to leverage that experience. You kind of want to piggyback on the customers that come before you and leverage all the tools and resources the contract manufacturers gained. Second to that, as I mentioned, all the contract manufacturers, they've got multiple customers at once building similar products to yours. And I guarantee you across those customers, there's going to be some overlap of buying the same raw materials. And so a value that a contract manufacturer brings to you is they can aggregate those parts and materials across their customers and buy at higher tier volumes to get better pricing, which they can pass on to you, which you will never be able to get, certainly early on. And so you want to leverage that purchasing power that they provide. And last, the scalability, right? So a contract manufacturer is set up to be able to scale up and scale down production as needed. So if your product, unless you have the luxury of being Apple, where you're producing your product day in, day out, 365 days a year, you're going to have to scale up and scale down throughout the year, okay? And a contract manufacturer is set up to do that. Let's just say your product is seasonal, so maybe you have to ramp up production for the holiday season and then ramp it back down for the off season. A contract manufacturer can very easily do that, whereas if you did it in-house, you couldn't. You'd have to keep your employees staffed and busy all the time, which can be very taxing, especially early on as you're trying to learn how your customers are responding to your products. So therefore, it's a great opportunity to reduce your potential capital costs, right? You don't have to invest in the tools and the equipment, the warehouse space, the employees, the labor costs, what have you. So most companies these days, even large volume companies and well-established Fortune 100 companies, still use contract manufacturers. They provide a great value to the whole manufacturing ecosystem. And that's true, again, across any industry, not just electrical and mechanical, but textiles and apparel and other industries as well. So where do you begin? All right. Well, my best advice is always be prepared. And when you're ready to start the conversation, you need to do three main things ahead of time. With these three elements, you'll be able to have a more serious conversation with the manufacturer. So the first thing that I always tell people is to predict your volumes. You estimate your volumes for the first 2 to 3 years of your product's life cycle. And it's totally normal that when you first go to production, you're going to be at a lower volume. That's understood. It's what does it look like after about 2 years of production? Is it a slow growth? Is it a fast growth? Is it hundreds of units a year? Is it millions of units a year? And that information is very important both to you and to the contract manufacturer because major decisions are made based on the volume. Even early on in your design, you might make different decisions on what parts to use or what processes to incorporate or how to design the product because of the volume. But where volume comes in most importantly to contract manufacturers, which I'll get into, is it lines you up with what their capacity is. Okay? The other is the sale price. What are customers going to pay for your products? And the reason why this is important is because you need to understand what it needs to cost you. So each industry, understandably, has their own margin goals of what your cost to your customer's cost needs to be. So a very known rule of thumb for consumer electronics, you usually want to have about a 4 times margin for the sale price to your cost. So if you've got the hottest wearable, it's going to be on the shelves of Best Buy next Christmas, and you're expecting customers to pay about $100 for your product, your total landed cost should be about 25. Okay, so it's a 4x. And each industry has slightly different guidelines. But what that does is it gives you a point to start negotiating with and to evaluate contract manufacturers' quotes. If you don't have that information, how are you going to know if they have a good price or not? Right? And the last thing, which also is often overlooked, I can't tell you how many times, is the actual requirements, written requirements and specifications of what your product is. Okay? What color is it? What size is it? What operating temperatures have to work in? What environments does it work in? What does it have to taste? How does it have to look? Because without these specifications, no one knows when they've done their job. They don't know if they're done, right? They don't know if they picked the right components. They don't know if they've designed it the right way. They don't know if they've assembled it the right way. They don't know if they've tested it enough. So in electrical and mechanical world, this is often referred to as the PRD, the Product Requirements Document. I'll admit I'm a little ignorant here. I don't know if there's something equivalent in the textiles and the apparel industry, but I imagine it's got to be something that specifies exactly the look and feel of the fabric, of the shirt, what have you, so that your designers know how to design it properly, but also your manufacturers know how to manufacture it as well. So these 3 things, if you don't have them, I think you're too early to start talking to contract manufacturers, because other than just a nice meet and greet, you're not going to be able to make much progress in the conversation. So how do you find a CM? Well, my best advice is through referrals. Any supplier, not just a contract manufacturer, but you always end up with the highest chance of success is through a referral. So clearly, if you have peers in the industry and they're maybe slightly ahead of you and they've used suppliers or contract manufacturers, ask them if they've had success or not. Another great resource that's underutilized is the vendors you buy your parts from. They very likely already know about several manufacturers that are buying parts from them as well and can make a recommendation. Other obvious resources are online, and those are valuable, but it's a little harder to vet through, especially if you have no context. You have to spend your own time vetting these suppliers to see if they are a good match for you. So referrals are definitely the way to go. All right, so what do you look for? So as I said, the reason why volume is so important is because contract manufacturers, they segregate themselves into different tiers based on their capacity to produce product. And they specifically design their factories to either be high volume, millions of units a month, or low volume per product, maybe only hundreds or thousands of units per month, because it requires a different setup of the factory, it requires different equipment, it requires different policies and procedures. And very few, if any, contract manufacturers can do both extremes well. Okay? And so you want to be prepared when you start talking to contract manufacturers just out of the gate. Are you the right match in the right tier? Okay? Because if you're talking to a tier 1 who's used to customers that are going to manufacture millions of units a year, and you're only looking at 100 units per year, you're not going to get a good match, and you're not going to get the service and the attention you need. And the same is true for vice versa. If you're trying to sell hundreds of thousands of units and your manufacturer can only do small thousands, you're going to start taxing their capacity and stressing them out, and they're going to start cutting corners, and you're going to see degradations in performance and quality as well. So this is one of the things I stress often is be honest with your volumes, with your numbers when you're talking to manufacturers, because they have their own ecosystem of resources that they have to gear up. They have to hire the right team. They have to set up the assembly lines to match your capacity. And if you mismatch intentionally, you're going to get kicked out, so quickly, but B, your product is going to see the attention and the service that it requires. The other thing, as I said, is to find a CM that actually has experience building products similar to yours, because you want to leverage the experience they've had building those other products prior to yours, because they're going to get more educated, they're going to get more experience, they're going to be able to provide better service to you. Honestly, it's a catch-22. You want to find a CM who's building a product near identical to you, like your competitor, but you don't want to use a CM that's building your competitor for IP reasons, but that's what you're looking for. So I added this little icon of a man to remind me to go off on a tangent and talk about a little anecdote about my own experiences. So I was consulting to a company in China building wearables, and I came in after the contract had been negotiated with the factory, and certain volumes were promised. The customer said, we're going to be producing hundreds of thousands of these per month, and so the factory said, great, and they set up the resources for that, and they brought in their A-team, and they got ready for hundreds of thousands of units per month. And when it turned out that it was only 1,000 units per quarter, I literally watched the A-team from the manufacturer get up, walk out of the room, and then the C team came in and said, we're your new team, right? So, and from there, the relationship went sour. The performance and the quality of our products started going downhill, and the relationship got really nasty, okay? So I've seen firsthand where customers intentionally inflated their volumes, and it did not work out well. So be honest. So when you're approaching contract manufacturing, a frame of reference to keep in mind is treat it like a marriage. You are finding a partner. You're going to be spending a lot of time with them for several years, hopefully. You want to make sure you're compatible, right? Not just in performance, but even culturally, socially. Can you talk to these people? Do you feel they understand you? Do you feel that if there's going to be a problem, they're going to be forthcoming and bring it up to you? Do you feel that if you have issues or concerns or ideas, that they're going to be receptive to it? It really is a marriage, and it's the right way to approach it. So just like you'd evaluate a potential partner, you should evaluate a contract manufacturer. Your product is your lifeline to success. Presumably that's why you're here, right? You've got this great idea for a great product. You want to get it to market. You want to be successful. Don't cut corners. Don't risk giving it to just anybody to build, right? Do your due diligence. Make sure they're the right person. Make sure they're the right manufacturer, the right supplier. You will not have success if you don't treat this seriously. And you really need to establish trust with them. And it's a bi-directional trust, right? You have to trust that they're going to build your product properly and that they're going to, look out for your best interest. But they see you as a risk too, especially when you're a startup, with maybe you don't have a lot of revenue, you don't have a lot of capital. They want to make sure that you're going to pay the bills. They're putting their neck on the line as well. And so you have to convince them just as much as they have to convince you that it's going to be a good relationship. They might say no to you just as easily as you might say no to them. So put your best foot forward. So one of the first things you want to do is request for a quote. And so there's often what's called an RFQ package where you send out information about your product to several contract manufacturers that you're evaluating, and they'll come back with a quote. And here is your first gut check if this is going to be a good match, okay? Look at the quote in detail. Take the time to analyze it. How complete is it? Do they touch all the major milestones, not just the cost of the parts, but do they also look at the peripheral costs and the tooling and the schedule, any of the logistics that are going to be involved? Do they pay attention to all the details that you'd expect? Do they go down to the layer of detail in the quote that you need to be able to properly evaluate it, or just a very high level, guess? How much attention to detail are they paying? Comprehension, do they actually understand your product? Look at the questions they ask, the assumptions they make. Do you feel that they understand what your product is and how the best way to manufacture it is? So even if they are, well established in a respectable company, if you're not meeting face to face on what your product is and what its requirements are, where the subtleties are, maybe it's not a good match. And then path to reduce costs. So this is, you're looking for how proactive is the contract manufacturer. So of course their initial quote is going to give you what will cost today. But one of the things that might make one contract manufacturer stick out over another is, do they take that extra step and say, well, here's how we can reduce the costs in the future, right? Whether it's through volume, whether it's through changing these processes, whether it's through purchasing these equipment, what can we do to reduce your costs and make your product better in the future? And these are good tales that they are interested in you just as much as you're interested in them. So take the time to review the quote. And another thing that I also can't stress enough, either before the quote or after you receive the quote, is take the time to go to their facility. Walk the floor, go to the factory, meet the managers. It doesn't matter if the factory is an hour away or across the world in China. There is so much value in actually going to the factory and seeing it firsthand. First off, it's a good first step to building that relationship that I talked about, building that trust, so face-to-face. So the managers at the factory, as I said, they see you as a risk just as much as you see them. If you show up with your CEO or your VPs or whatever, they know you're serious about them just as much, so that they're going to put in more effort. That it's a sign to them that they should take the time to take you seriously just as much as you're taking them seriously. Visiting the factory floor, it allows you to see where your product's going to be built, how it's going to be built. That type of information can feed back into making your product better, because you're going to be able to make decisions knowing how they're going to be building your product. That's called DFM, Design for Manufacturability. It's going to allow future references. If the factory is halfway across the world and you're doing conversations over email or phone, you can be more specific about some reference because you've seen it firsthand, or you've met one of the line managers and you can call them out by name. So there's a lot of value in actually visiting the factory. Local versus abroad. So this is a question I get asked all the time, and I want to make this clear that it is a very common misconception that manufacturing overseas, specifically China, is cheaper. That is not necessarily true, okay? There's a lot of aspects and costs that go into manufacturing beyond labor. And you have to take into account all these aspects to evaluate the true cost of what it'll take to manufacture your product. It's called the landed cost. So the cost it takes to get your product all the way to where you're going to be inventorying it. So while, yes, some costs like labor may go down when you use overseas, some of the other costs like logistics and travel will go up. And some of the non-tangible costs like language barriers or time zone differences will go up, and because you're going to misunderstand each other, or there's a higher chance of misinterpreting your instructions because of some language barrier. And you have to take that into account when you're truly comparing local versus abroad. So when you're looking at this, the things to think about are stability. How stable is your product? Are you going to be making a lot of changes? Or is it really, really ready to go to production? Because contract manufacturers don't like change. And so every time you change something, they have to go through a process, and they're going to charge you for it. So keep that in mind when you start approaching contract manufacturers. Those are costs that often get underlooked. Complexity. How complex is your product? How many parts are there? How manual is it to assemble or test versus automated? If it's a completely automated product, then maybe you keep it local, right? So because the cost of labor is insignificant, it's really not part of your product. If it is a very complex product, then maybe you look overseas. Volumes are an obvious one, so the higher the volumes, typically the lower the costs. And then another non-tangible cost that also gets underlooked is experience. How experienced is your team? So the less experience your team has with manufacturing, the higher the chances are you're going to make a mistake or you're not going to catch something in time, which leads to cost, higher cost, either loss of time or actual loss of dollars to correct the mistake. So don't just think that because it's in China, it's going to be cheaper. And here's where you have to evaluate the risk versus the costs. And this too is something that I like to tell customers is when you're first entering the market, you're a new company, you have one goal. Your goal is to get your product to market quickly, okay? You need your product to get into customers' hands to begin collecting revenue and to begin getting customer feedback. Do you have the right product that the customer wants? Do you have the right product market fit? Why crank up volume in your production, or why try and squeeze out that last dollar in your production if you're not even building the right thing? So don't get caught up in costs when you're first starting manufacturing. You should be focusing on reducing risk to getting your product to customers' hands. And so don't increase risk by trying to cut corners on your costs. It's okay to start local just to reduce the risk, even if it's a higher cost, and maybe you're not actually making a profit initially, but you'll have a much higher chance of success of getting your product to market. And you can always move your product to another factory later. So what are your responsibilities that will help contract manufacturers feel at ease of working with you? So one of the first things is what I talked about a little bit earlier is design for manufacturability. And this is where one of the biggest gaps between the prototype and the production unit is that I talked about. When you're designing your product for manufacturability, sometimes you make decisions that don't always make intuitive sense because it doesn't change the functionality or the performance of your product, but it actually makes the efficiency of manufacturing it go up. And the chances of making mistakes in production go down. And these are the things that manufacturers look for. They don't want to get stuck with building a very complex product. They want to make sure that it's designed properly, setting them up for success. So these are some things that I encourage you to look into when you're designing your product early on, are what's called DFM principles. And the other thing, as I mentioned before, is minimize the changes. Contract manufacturers hate change. They can't do their job if you constantly change the product. They will be able to help you better when the product is stable because it allows them to iterate the process, to improve on the process, to find new ways to assemble or test it faster. They can get better purchasing power, as I mentioned, because you're having repeat orders and they can negotiate better terms with their suppliers. If you keep changing the product, the design, they can't do their job. And always be responsive. So if they've got problems and ask questions of you, make sure you're there. Either you pick up the phone, you respond to email, or you hop on a plane and get there. Because again, the more responsive you are, it shows that you're interested and serious about the product, and they in turn are going to take you seriously and be more motivated to help you when things happen. So the final selection checklist. So you're reviewing several contract manufacturers. So this is the 5 points that I encourage you to go through. So first off, trust your gut. Your gut is going to be your best ruler. You know, just like you evaluate people in your relationships, your marriage partner, use your gut. Is this the right partner for me? Okay, and that's non-tangible, but it will go so far in making the right decision. Review the proposal, as I said. Visit the facility, assess the cultural match, right? So even if it's local, do you guys see eye to eye? Do you speak the same language, whether it's English or not? Do they understand you? Do you have, and that happens, right? Some people, best intentions, they just don't communicate well. But again, if that is an apparent problem, it's just introducing risk of miscommunication or misunderstanding, which could lead to a problem. So you want to make sure you guys match culturally. And then what I find very useful is it does help the best you can to reduce everything to a cost, right? Because that's apples to apples. You can do fair comparison. You can reduce things to dollars. So parts of material and labor are easy because that's usually a hard quote. So that's easy to compare. But it's the other things that might take a little modeling or assumptions on how you reduce them to a dollar amount. So one thing that is also important are what's called like the tools or the startup costs. So if the contract manufacturer has to build a mold for your injection molded part, or they have to buy a tool or special equipment and they charge that to you, don't ignore those costs, right? So if they quote you and say your product, the parts, assembly, the labor will cost $10 per unit, but you have to invest $100,000 in this piece of equipment to do so, don't ignore that cost, right? Because if you only build one product, the cost of that product is not $10, it's $100,000 and $10. It's not until you build 100,000 units will that cost actually be 11, closer to the material and labor cost. So don't ignore the cost of those peripheral components. The logistics that I mentioned, once the contract manufacturer's done with your product, how does it get to your customer? Someone has to pay for that. Do you have to warehouse it, inventory it? Do you have to ship it by boat, by air? What? How does it get to your customer? Those are part of your costs too. Don't ignore those. And the travel. So I guarantee you, 2 days into new production, you're going to get a call from the factory saying there's a problem. We need you here. Okay? So if your factory is up in the valley, about an hour away, you can be there in your lunch break, fix the problem, be home for dinner. Okay? If your factory is in the middle of China and you got to get on a plane, 15 hours to Hong Kong, a 4-hour bus ride to your hotel, and another 2-hour ride to the factory, that's 20 hours just to get there, what does that cost? Okay? Even if they quoted you $6 per unit and the factory in Chatsworth quoted you $10 per unit, that cost to send one of your engineers to China for a minimum of a week, what does that cost your company, right? Is it worth that $4 difference? It's really something to think about. And then the troubleshooting, as I talked about, how stable is your product, how well is the communication, how much time and effort and cost is it going to take to troubleshoot problems. So don't ignore a lot of these peripheral costs. They will go a long way and be able to fairly compare apples to apples. And when do you start engaging with a contract manufacturer? In my opinion, as early as possible. So I've talked about some of the requirements you need to have ready before you can start engaging with them. But when you're ready to sit at the table and actually start on your products, that's as early as possible once you've started the contract. Because, as I said, contract manufacturers have tons of experience that you can leverage and brings value to your team. You want them to review your product and give you recommendations on how to improve it as early on in your design cycle as possible. And again, that's the DFM principle. It's a fundamental component of manufacturing because it increases your chances of success tremendously. And if you wait too late to get their feedback, it could be very expensive, if not impossible, to incorporate their changes into your design, and you're setting yourself up for failure. Protecting IP is definitely something that people ask me, especially when we talk about manufacturing overseas. There are these horror stories. Yes, IP theft does happen. It happens overseas, it happens here. It happens when you buy a car. Sales deception is not unique to manufacturing. But honestly, if it happens to you, it's your fault. It means you didn't do your due diligence to properly evaluate the contract manufacturer, or set up the proper terms and conditions in your contract, or set up the necessary resources to properly oversee them or evaluate their performance. So I don't want to say it's not a problem, but it's your problem and it's your responsibility to take care of it. Hire a lawyer, hire what's called a source inspector to help oversee. They can do surprise visits to the factory to see what's going on, but that's on you to set up. All right, the final takeaways. So remember, it's a marriage, okay? And you really need to approach it as such. It's a partner that you're spending a lot of time with. Take the time to evaluate them and make sure it's a good partnership. Be honest with your requirements. I've seen customers who try and be a little deceitful or maybe not forthcoming, and it only ends up hurting them in the end because the contract manufacturer can't do their job helping you if you're not honest with them. If you're not honest with the volumes, if you're not honest with the specifications or the requirements, they will not be able to provide the best service possible for you. So don't be discreet. Amortize all these startup fees. So I went through that. So all the peripheral costs, the setup fees, the tooling costs, the equipment costs, the travel costs. Don't negate those. Don't ignore those. Those are very important when you're looking at your true costs for your products. Be prepared. As I said, do your homework ahead of time. Have your requirements ready. Have your numbers ready. The conversations will go much more smoothly. Be humble. Recognize that your contract manufacturer probably is much better at this than you are. Take their advice. It will only help you, both in your product but also in the relationship. And then lastly, trust your gut. You really have nothing better than that. Your gut's going to tell you, is this the right manufacturer for me or not? So, thank you. I really appreciate it. Hopefully I was able to teach you guys something and learn something. If you do have more questions, I have other articles about manufacturing and anecdotes and tips and tricks on my blog. You can follow me at all these great locations on social media. And again, thank you so much to Z and to Make It in LA.
So what's the difference between IP and patent?
A patent is the document.
Sorry, so is that the same worry for the customer to a manufacturer?
No. So the patent is the document that legally protects your IP. That's the paper that says, this is my intellectual property, I have rights to it, you do not. IP is a more encompassing term, which might be written down in a patent and recorded, or it might be trade secrets, or it might be some special sauce that because the contract manufacturer is building your product, they can see it, whereas other customers wouldn't. So IP, the question was, what's the difference between IP and a patent? IP is a more encompassing term for anything that's proprietary, whereas a patent is an actual legal document.
And how well does a patent protect you?
How well does a patent protect you? It protects you as good as your pockets of how much cash you have. So, there are bad people out there. I'm not going to say it doesn't exist. Companies who know they have deeper pockets and better lawyers, and I defer you to a patent lawyer on developing the right patent strategy. There's things you can do between a filed patent, a provisional patent, or just trade secrets. And there's certain strategies that companies have on how they use each of those options to be able to build often what's called a IP moat around their company to protect themselves from competitors.
About the patent, would I need one if my product is being manufactured in China? Would I need a patent in China and the US?
Would you need a patent in China and US if you're manufacturing in China? Again, I defer you to a patent lawyer, but my gut is no, because it really is more where you're selling your product, less of where you're manufacturing it. But I'm not a lawyer, nor do I pretend to be. So if you're serious about that, I've never had to get a patent in China as well as the US. If that helps.
So to get samples or something from a manufacturer, do you pay for those, or are they free?
So the question was, do you have to pay for samples from a manufacturer? And I presume you mean samples of your own product, like in early prototypes?
To check out how they produce my product.
Yes, sure. So that's a great question. You kind of have to, you want to try before you buy, because it's a big investment and big effort to start working with a contract manufacturer, and so you want to evaluate them somehow. Some contract manufacturers are set up for that, where they're happy to do small prototype production runs. You can even use that just as a resource for doing your own prototyping, because it allows you, as I said, it allows you to start that relationship with the contract manufacturer early, They'll get to know your product better. They'll be able to give you feedback earlier so that when you are ready to ramp up production, the supply chains are set up, the relationships are set up, so you're good to go. So that is a good strategy to use the same contract manufacturer for mass production as prototyping, but it also allows you a chance, if the prototypes aren't turning out well, to back out.
Do you have garment manufacturers do prototyping?
Do garment manufacturers do prototyping? Yes, everybody does. They have to.
And my other question is, my materials are really cheap. What would keep a manufacturer from just taking my idea and
Running with it.
running with it?
Well, that goes, so the question was, what keeps a manufacturer from taking your idea? I'm repeating it for the recording. That goes back to my slide about IP. You know, get a good lawyer, do your due diligence, trust your gut. Do you think they're that type of company that would steal it? You know, again, there are firms that do surprise visits to factories you can pay and hire to show up unannounced and see what they're doing at night. You know, if it's really a big concern, honestly, if anything, it's a compliment to you that your product is so good they want to steal it.
I was gonna say,
Maybe
Yeah.
that lucky.
Yeah.
some competition.
Yeah, yeah. It's there's no like easy answer to that other than be prepared. You know.
Hi, I'm Isabel Maxwell, and I'm working with an organization from overseas. Actually, it's from Israel, and they do makeathons all over the world, and they specifically prototype products for people who are disabled, and they do them. And their mission is to make them very incredibly affordable, even if they're already off the shelf, or to make them for people who just, it's not made anywhere, neither by private nor by government. And my question is, we would like possibly to come and take some of that extra manufacturing space in Los Angeles. Is it your experience that if the organization, in this case it happens to be a non-profit, doesn't have much money, might manufacturers be willing to team up and take some of the revenue if you're able to ultimately manufacture it well?
It's a fair question. Honestly, I'd have to defer to manufacturers, and I know there are some here in the audience. They could probably answer that better. I think it depends on the type of business. If it's a good match, like if it's an area they want to get into, they might do it for a reduced fee, again, for getting that experience. So maybe they use you as leverage to go after someone building the similar product, but for a higher profit, which happens. And I've worked for companies like that, you know, that contract manufacturers have been very interested in my product, giving me discounts because it was a new market for them, and they wanted to, it was a symbiotic relationship. I needed them to manufacture my product, and they needed me to be the guinea pig for them to learn how to manufacture that product. So it does exist, you know.
I had a general question related to if it's better to bundle services within a contract manufacturer, like logistics, manufacturing, setting the product and shipping it out, or is it better to separate
Do yourself.
and use different services?
Yeah, that too, I think it's circumstantial. I personally prefer the one neck to choke model, where I use a supplier to do as much as possible, assuming I trust them. There are strategies where people intentionally separate it, and that's another way people protect their IP, is if they have separate manufacturers building separate parts of their product so no one sees the whole thing. If one manufacturer gives you great pricing on the assembly and testing of the product, but their logistics prices are too high, and someone else obviously better, maybe it's just financially makes sense to have in two separate places. Definitely circumstantial, but it's a great first approach. See if you can get everything, especially again, as your startup, you only have so much time yourself and so much bandwidth, and so if there's only one supplier, one phone call you have to make for all these services, that's great. And maybe you do pay a little bit more for that, just for that ease.
Hi, we're at a position where we have a good prototype. We've been talking to contracted manufacturers who want a complete CAD setup.
Mm-hmm.
Our CAD is probably about 60% complete. Some of the contract manufacturers won't deal with us at all.
Mm-hmm.
What do we do in that situation?
Complete it. Honestly, and I agree with them, right? Because it goes back to that specifications document that I mentioned. If your CAD files are not complete with what's called GD&T, so your tolerances and your materials, they're taking on all this risk. How do they know what tolerances you need, right? So, and it also helps them with their pricing. So if your product has, a certain dimension plus or minus, a centimeter, it can be a lot cheaper to manufacture than something that has a millimeter tolerance. And if that's not written down, they can't give you a fair quote, and you're just setting yourself up for failure.
Hi, thanks so much for the info. I hear it's good to get referrals, so do you happen to have any referrals for local PCB and component assembly?
I do, yes.
Awesome.
We have one here.
Maybe offline.
Local.
Yeah, or go to the website and contact me. Yeah,
Okay,
we'll
great.
talk about it. Yeah, no, there's definitely, and to be serious, there's some great resources. Here in the audience that I know,
Michael over there.
and B in LA. You can get top quality here, all the way from high volume to low volume. Yeah.
Yeah, up here.
At one point, sorry, my voice is turned on. As far as cottage industries, at what point do you think it's realistic for them to look into manufacturing a product instead of doing everything in-house? Oh, I'm Stephanie from the SoCal Yield. Hi.
Okay.
Sorry.
Hey.
Voice sucks.
I encourage you, as I said, to start talking with manufacturers as early as you can because of the feedback they can give you that you can incorporate into your product early on and it has more value. And you can be, very upfront with them. Just say, we're not ready to sign a contract, but we'd love to learn. We're new to manufacturing, I'm assuming. We'd love what it would take to work with you, right? Be honest. Again, it goes back to the other principle. Be honest with them. Admit that you need help. And that's another gut check. If they're happy to help you and walk you through the process, that's a good sign. If they say, we don't want to work with you, we don't want to spend the time, walk away.
So it's worth it to reach out to them even though it may be a year or two out till you're ready?
Yeah, I mean, you need to give them something to work with, right? So if you have a prototype or something they can look at, something that conveys what your product is, and you've identified what you think the risks are, where the challenges are, or if you have what's called a bill of materials, right? What materials are going to be in your product, then the conversation is more valuable. If it's just an idea in your head, there's only so much tangible advice they can give you. Actionable advice.
Okay, we got some back here. And then we'll wrap up after a couple more questions.
Michael, really enjoyed the presentation. I've heard you talk a little bit about different parts of that, but to see it all succinctly put together, I think is of great value.
Thank you.
My question, I guess, is what are some of the signals and signs at which point you would be making a serious decision as to whether you're going to cut bait and leave and go to another manufacturer?
So again, like that anecdote where the A team walked out, and so if something tells you, whether it's in your face or more subtle, that they're not paying attention to you, they're not returning your calls, you start to see quality go down. There are metrics used, what's called first pass yield, which you can actually measure the performance of the production. And so if you get those reports and you see quality is going down, that might be a time to have a conversation. Obviously, like any relationship, you want to see if you can salvage what you have first and see if it's corrected. Maybe it's just a misunderstanding. But if it really is going sour, look for quality issues, look for responsiveness. If you start getting bills for every little nuance, right, that maybe before they kind of just skirted under the rug, it's usually signs that the relationship's going south.